Welcome back to Forbidden Fruit. I'm your host, Ariel, and Ramona is still not here. Together, we're going over chapters 1 and 2 of our book, and we don't have a special guest, but I do have a discussion topic. It was supposed to be a discussion topic with Mona. Her friend told me she's digesting, whatever that means, but I made sure she knew when to come and record. I can't believe I'm the one who works with the dead, and she's the one with her head in the clouds. I would have just waited, but I'm usually either working or hiking or with my band, so if she doesn't show up, I guess it'll just be me looking into the void to say hello. Anyway, we'll just see what happens, I guess. If you're one of the 3 or so people who knows this exists, chances are you're following along, but for the sake of being thorough and professional, like a real live podcast and not some random person who scribbled their own logo in fresco and added text in MS Paint, I'll actually go over the chapters in some depth. I suppose I should plaster a big ol' spoiler warning here. Although again, if you're actually here, you're Ramona's friends, so chances are you know exactly what we're here for. Chapter 1 begins with a definition. Vampirism. Noun. 1. The condition of being a vampire, marked by the need to ingest blood and extreme vulnerability to sunlight. 2. The act of preying upon others for financial or emotional gain. 3. A gigantic pain in the butt. Immediately the tone is set from the end of the definition to the way Molly Harper, that remember is the author, Molly Harper, to the way she introduces Jane Enid Jameson, our main character. It's obvious this isn't taking itself as seriously as its peers. I guess the title should have said as much, but it didn't click until I started reading, and I'll be honest, my gut reaction was, hey, that's a bummer. Sue me, I like the dark part of dark romance more than I like the romance part of dark romance, but it's a great premise for a comedy, and the more I think on it, the more I realize it wouldn't work if it did take itself seriously. I'll get to the world building in chapter 2, because even though it contains a pretty big lore dump, I think we're going to see the world sprawl out throughout the book like ink being dropped onto water, so we might get to learn all about this together as we go. Chapter 1 introduces Jane, our protagonist, on the last day of her life. I want to be clear here that, unlike some other vampire books I could mention, this is not a teaser. This is literally the day she dies. Jane Enid Jameson is, in a fun little flashback, she's a 27-year-old children's librarian working in her hometown of Half Moon Hollow, Kentucky. But for the majority of the chapter, she's a 27-year-old former children's librarian, bitterly spending her $25 severance package at the local bar. Something tells me this is going to come back later. She seems so passionate. She went away to get a degree in library science and came back to middle of nowhere, Kentucky, to work at her beloved hometown library. She cites the rise in literacy rates and the kids who participated in her programs as the reason she should be kept on, whereas her boss cites budget cuts as the reason she shouldn't be. She's in this for the love of her field, the love of reading, and honestly, the love for her hometown. Something I noticed from the jump is how much care is given to the area, which is fictional but clearly based on a real place, which is very well loved. So, back at the bar, which is called Shenanigans because of course it is. That's the perfect name for this particular book. Despite having enough blood in her alcohol system to remember her lifelong crush, she does not have the courage, or probably even the equilibrium if we're being real here, to go talk to him. As an aside, maybe it's just me, but every time I see a potential love interest who's too good to be true, like Adam Morrow, pretty, kind, a veterinarian, I'm immediately suspicious. I have no idea if he'll even be important to the plot, but if he is, I think he's evil. Real life vets are wonderful, and Jane is right to think he's great for being one, but also, yeah, evil. Anyway, Jane is eventually approached by a handsome stranger, which is notable because Half Moon Hollow is small enough that even if she didn't know him, she should have seen him around or known his family, right? But he's a stranger. When she finally gets his name, he introduces himself in an old-fashioned sort of way, which lets you know who wears the fangs in this relationship. Mind you, this is in Kentucky, so I need to be clear that when he says, "Jane Enid Jameson, my name is Gabriel Nightingale. I would very much like to keep you company till you're able to drive home," it's in a rural East Kentucky accent, so not like mine. I do not care if later Jane clarifies that Gabriel has a different accent. This is burned into my brain. We've got East Kentucky vampires who live in Kentucky right now, and I swear to God, if Ms. Harper mentions the Civil War in any capacity except a passing one, I might scream. Like, these are vampires, monsters, creatures of the night, you know the drill. If they are that old, I feel like the only reason they'd bother to poke their noses in human wars is to get free food. Anyway, Gabriel and Jane argue about authors, which I like because it shows a little bit of personality from both. They're adults having adult fun and an adult conversation in which they both participate, if a little disrespectfully. Jane mentions that they've resolved this argument by discussing, quote, "a much more neutral subject, religion," unquote. It's unclear, mostly due to Jane's inability to fully remember this first conversation, whether Gabriel is flirting with her or simply having a conversation with someone he thinks is interesting, which is different. And I feel like the author gets that, although I could be wrong, so I'll reserve judgment there. But Jane is flirting for sure. Not really for any specific goal, just because it's fun to flirt sometimes. That's something else that Ms. Harper really captures in this scene. Sometimes it's just fun to have fun. Sometimes a dance is just a dance. You can flirt and then leave, and nobody's feelings have to be hurt if people stop taking every single word as a promise for the future. It's the difference between a romance written by someone who's getting some and a romance written by someone who just really, really wants to. Jane eventually does leave once she feels sober enough to drive, which I personally don't recommend, but I get why you wouldn't want to leave your janky-ass car at a place called Shenanigans overnight. Unfortunately for Jane, but fortunately for anyone she might have hit on the way home, her car dies, and I can't decide if leaving it on the side of the road is safer than leaving it at Shenanigans, but she doesn't want to call for help because she's aware that she still might have alcohol in her system, so fuck it, I guess. Side of the road it is. She has to walk the rest of the way home. Incidentally, there is another drunk driver on the road. She does not get hit, but when she does trip over her shit shoes and fall face first into the ditch, and oh my god, this is so good. This particular drunk driver thinks he's just spotted a deer. He gets out his trusty rifle, takes a shot, grumbles to himself at the deer getting away, and leaves Jane to bleed out at the side of the road, entirely unaware that he's just shot a woman. Look, I'm not saying it's good Jane got shot. Violence against women isn't funny, and neither is second-degree manslaughter, generally speaking. In this case, though, there's an entire rest of the book. We know she's okay. We know what happens next. This is not a plot twist, even if it wasn't really broadcasted. It's just such a mundane and inglorious way to go out, you know? You would expect a vampire book to have its protagonist die doing something more interesting than getting mistaken for game by the town drunk. You'd also expect her last words to be something more profound than "oh crap," but this is a comedy. The chapter ends by saying, quote, "I was cold, I was tired, and then I woke up as one of the undead." I think we can all see why this made it out of the slush pile. Moving on to chapter 2, it opens with a quote from a fictional book called The Guide for the Newly Undead. "Welcome to the fascinating world of the undead. Please use this guidebook as a handy reference as you make your first steps toward eternity. Inside, you will find information on vampire nutrition, relationships, and safety. But before learning about your future, a word about our past." It looks like each chapter will have something cute at the top, and I am digging it so far. So, chapter 2 is half lore dump, half morning after, and it's interesting because we get a glimpse of the world Jane lives in. Chapter 1 leads us to believe this is set in our world, but Chapter 2 makes it clear this is a bit of an alternate universe, just slightly to the left of ours. I think it's a more fun universe. I'm gonna read this bit in full because I don't think any summary of mine could do it justice. After thousands of years operating right under mortal noses, the great vampire coming out of 2000 wasn't the result of a TV expose, a medical breakthrough, or a chatty vampire interviewee. It was a lawsuit. Some of the undead choose to hold on to their original lives, continuing to work, pay taxes, and floss. In 1999, a recently turned Milwaukee tax consultant named Arnie Frink wanted to continue working for the firm of Jacoby, Myers, and Letts. But the human resources rep, as ignorant as the rest of the world about the existence of the undead, refused to allow Arnie to keep evening hours. Arnie got a fellow vamp with a 200-year-old medical degree to diagnose him with porphyria, a painful allergy to sunlight, but the evil HR rep could not be moved. Even if leaving his condo before sunset left Arnie with second-degree burns and body odor similar to scorched dog hair, he was expected to keep banker's hours. Mr. Jacoby was a bit paranoid about office security. This prevented Arnie from making a living, so to speak, and interfered with his pursuit of happiness. So Arnie did what any red-blooded American would do. He sued. When the allergy discrimination argument failed to impress a judge, a sunblock-slathered Arnie flipped out in court and demanded that his lawyer be fired so he could represent himself. As his indignant counsel slunk away, Arnie declared that he was a vampire with a medical condition that rendered him unable to work during the day, thereby making him subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act. After Arnie was hauled off by the men in white coats, his vitals were checked, and the doctors noticed that his heart wasn't beating. Plus, he bit a nurse who tried to take his rectal temperature, but I think we all can agree she had that coming. After extensive psych evaluations, the doctors agreed that it was possible that Arnie was telling the truth. but they weren't willing to put it in writing. After several lengthy appeals, Arnie won his lawsuit and got a settlement, evening hours, and an interview with Barbara Walters. The international vampire community was incensed and formally voted to have Arnie staked to an anthill at dawn. But after the media firestorm and the I told you so from the internet conspiracy nuts, most vampires realized they should have come out a century ago. If nothing else, maybe we all could have avoided the goth movement. This is funny to me specifically because as a former goth, excuse you, Miss Harper, but at the same time, as a former goth, yeah, this is correct. The author, through either Jane or the Guide to the Newly Undead, that's sort of unclear, paints a vivid picture of a booming nightlife for undead Americans, which, oh my god, of course they would. And she gives us interesting little tidbits, like the aisle at Walmart, where vampires can buy everything from synthetic blood to crazy good sunblock, just a few years after Walmart also started providing vampire home defense kits, including holy water, crosses, prayer wards, and such and sundry, which were mostly useless. Post Great Coming Out, which also, oh my god, there's a lot of upheaval in the actual vampire community, including like serious attempts at establishing equal rights internationally and prosecuting people who murder vampires, even though there won't be a body left behind, which is a neat little piece of world building I would normally spend weeks geeking out about if I had time and a captive audience. But also, there's a new branch of anthropology called vampire behaviorists, and it's just so human, it kills me. One of the things I really like about this world building is that it brings up certain tropes and myths and silly little gimmicks from vampire stories and either explains or sort of disregards or deconstructs them without being disdainful. I feel like Ms. Harper knows her roots and respects her forebears, but it isn't particularly invested in following tradition unless it's fun. It makes sense. This is not only a comedy, but a modern take on an old myth. If we are using it as a metaphor, we should consider what and who we are representing and, how we're going about that. So in regards to the myths and symbols, Ms. Harper brings up things like religious items. She makes it clear that the amount of aversion a vampire has to any particular religious symbol will be directly proportionate to how much they believed in it during their lifetime. It's not just things like crosses either. Names or practices or locations are just as important, and it doesn't matter what religious tradition we're talking about, so long as belief was involved. It's an interesting concept, but it's only touched on, partially because this is a soft magic system, and partially because Jane was an apathetic agnostic, so she's cautious but mostly unbothered. The book mentions things like scattering seeds or untying knots, which will only work on vampires who have OCD, and touches upon how sleeping in coffins is out of fashion. Nobody knows why vampires can see themselves in mirrors but not water, and how garlic does repel vampires because it's stinky and they don't want to smell it close up with their enhanced senses. Quote, also, for some reason, vampires tend to wear a lot of leather. Animal rights issues aside, I don't think that's an indicator of evil. When vampires are turned, they buy leather pants. It's kind of like when human men get divorced. They get a sad apartment and a boat. It's a rite of passage. I've never met a divorced man who could afford a boat, but I get the vibe, and it's delightful. And this part also goes into how vampires are turned. It doesn't just take a bite. It is a sort of ritualistic thing where the sire will drain the child almost to the point of death, which is hard because vampires usually only drink about a pint at a time, which, as an aside, is something I find kind of charming because the idea of a vampire getting full is cute. Like, you want some biker? Nah, he smells fine, but I just ate some really good Librarian. Anyway, then the child has to drink from the vampire, at which point the child dies and stays dead for 3 days, hopefully not getting embalmed or cremated before they revive. Yikes. This isn't an original idea, but I do like the fact that it's hard on the vampire as well. And I guess you could theoretically do this non-consensually, but it seems like it'd be safer and easier to just either get consent or, not do it. There's an invitation here for the human to participate in something taboo and new and strange and scary. And if they say yes, their whole world changes. So the morning after, or more specifically, 3 days after, in the evening, Jane wakes up in an unfamiliar bedroom, and she's not happy about it because she jumps to a normal conclusion about what happened last night. I can't remember anything after leaving the bar. I have another little section to read, mostly because it's hilarious, but a little bit because it serves to show Jane as a character thus far. I won't be doing this routinely in future episodes, but in these early chapters, I wanted to establish who we're working with. After establishing that she is, in fact, a 27-year-old almost virgin librarian and inviting us to absorb the cliche, we're hit with this passage. Beyond a rather regrettable let's just get it over with encounter with a fellow virgin and close friend Dave Chandler my sophomore year of college, and an even more regrettable my first time was awful, maybe it would be better with someone with more experience, with a teaching assistant my senior year, my sexual repertoire was somewhat limited. My problem with sex was, along with most of my problems, rooted in my brain. My head was always speeding ahead of my libido. I could never relax enough to let nature take its course. And there was just plain bad sex. My partner mistaking me yelling when I caught my hair on his watch band for cries of passion, having to go to the emergency room for a broken nose when Justin Tyler headbutted me, the guy who got a mid-thrust leg cramp and whined to the point that I walked out of his apartment half-dressed. I always hoped for this spark of chemistry and compatibility, a flash of clarity to let me know that this was the guy, this was the time, so I should let go and enjoy myself. But it rarely came, and by no small coincidence, neither did I. Between these extremely unsatisfying experiences and my apparent inability to develop that spark with any man on the planet, I just decided sex wasn't worth the effort. If I wanted to spend an evening half-dressed, humiliated, and unfulfilled, I'd try amateur night down at the Booby Hatch. So I channeled my energy into my work at the library and obsessively collecting obscure BBC movies on DVD. The Woman in White with Justine Waddell is a life changer. Let's put aside for a second that I don't know if that's Justine Waddell or Justine Waddell. I'm not gonna look it up. I am not surprised at all that a character like Jane Jameson would like The Woman in White. I'm also not surprised that Jane hasn't ever had good sex, although I am delighted that she has experience. Jane is self-aware enough to poke fun at her obvious typecast, but at the same time, she values herself and she's outspoken. Despite being written as plain, she's not all that self-conscious beyond the petty schoolyard bullying that stuck in her craw for a while, but ultimately didn't do long-term damage. Maybe I'm just making patterns in the stars here, but Molly Harper's vampires really feel sort of queer-coded. Not even in a queer-coded monster way, which is like all vampires, but in a more genuine and kind way. I'll reserve judgment for now because, again, I'm only on chapter 2 and things might not go how I think, but as a lesbian who needed time and experience to figure myself out, Jane really feels familiar to me. From the description, Gabriel is gonna be Jane's love interest, so I'm saying dash-coded for a reason, but there is something compelling about the idea of accepting something new into your life, something that changes your sense of identity fundamentally, even though you're still you in every other way that matters. And knowing that even if you manage to hide it from everybody else, you can't unring that bell. On the other hand, there's a whole community out there full of people like you, and maybe that's a little scary too. Anyway, Jane rolls out of bed and looks into the mirror to see what the damage is. I was pleasantly surprised that when she takes in her post-death glow-up, she's shocked and outraged. She liked herself. Her body was fine, except for her boobs, maybe. She did want them to be a little bigger than mosquito bites, which they aren't now, but nobody's perfect. So she screeches. That's the book's word, not mine. She finally did it. Mama tranquilized me and booked me on Extreme Makeover. And Gabriel, who's thus far been lurking like a creep, asks, "What's Extreme Makeover?" We get treated to a scene with Jane clinging to the ceiling like Spider-Man, accusing Gabriel of drugging and date raping her, which, yeah, reasonable conclusion, before she jumped up and clung to the ceiling like a mythical creature and or superhero. I do think it's funny that when Gabriel drops the bomb sort of nonchalantly that she's a vampire, she replies with, "No, I'm a librarian." Like vampire is a job. Girl, this ain't a RPG. We see Gabriel's ability to manipulate memory, at least to some degree, in order to make Jane remember what happened. I'm suspicious of this ability for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, if I had a magic memory eraser bringer outer thing, I might keep him on hand to help me remember, anything from my pre-college education. Her memory of being turned is both gross and weirdly sensual, which, yeah, girls drinking blood, of course it is. And once again, I want to stress my appreciation that this is such a mutual thing. In Jane's case, it was an unusual situation. It wasn't as consensual as it could have and should have been. Jane didn't choose to get shot, but she did get offered the choice to live. Gabriel offered to let her die. She chose to live on. Quote, "You know what I am. You know what you are," he said quietly, as if we were talking about being Episcopalian. "I offered you a choice, and you took it." I shot him what I hoped was a truly scathing look. "Some choice? I was dying." The quote continues, but that part feels familiar too. Both in the sense that it's a spooky vampire quote she immediately subverts by being weird, and in the sense that sometimes even if you make a choice to take the plunge into a new world, sometimes you're scared and regretful later, even though you were dying inside and now you feel like you can finally see for the first time. I won't harp on that anymore. It's also interesting that this book begins their relationship on a sort of contentious note. Jane feels a little bit taken advantage of, even though she ultimately did make the choice to live on. Gabriel either doesn't understand her perspective or is too old to remember having been in her place once. Jane's life wasn't perfect, but she made it hers. She found ways to make up for what she lacked and generally felt good about herself. She feels like Gabriel took that away from her. I'd argued that Bud McElroy, the drunk hunter, took that away from her, but Gabriel is right there, and Bud is probably out drinking somewhere, so Gabriel gets the brunt of her anger. It's not rational, but it is human. So Jane runs, which is unsurprising, and Gabriel fails to stop her, which is only unsurprising because the plot needs to happen. And she manages to find her way home, despite Gabriel's house being fairly far away. When she gets home, she's immediately greeted by her worried best friend, Zeb Lavelle, and the chapter ends. I'm glad that chapter 2 establishes Jane has a social life, even if it's limited. She's not alone. Now I'm going to discuss the chapters. First, some things that I liked. Jane is an adult woman who may not have her shit entirely together, but she's not a walking disaster. She's not waiting to have her life drastically altered. She's not lamenting over her boring life. In fact, when we first meet her plastered at the local bar, she's upset because she lost a piece of her life that she genuinely loved. She's made a life she cares about, in a home she loves. And God, can I just take another moment to appreciate that? Ms. Harper doesn't dedicate 1,000 pages to describing Half Moon Hollow, but it feels deliberate and careful. Through Jane's chaotic and somewhat dry humor, Ms. Harper pokes fun at this small town without being disdainful and without romanticizing it. I hope that trend continues. I'm a sucker for world building, but moreover, I do think everybody starts hearing the pluck of an out-of-tune banjo whenever they think of Kentucky, and frankly, I won't tolerate any banjo slander. Anyway, I just appreciate the adultness of the first 2 chapters. It's refreshing. The first-person narrative is a pretty obvious choice. This was published in 2009, back when vampire romance was all the rage. I don't mind it. There are pros and cons to every point of view style depending on what kind of narrative you're going for, and first person puts you into the protagonist's head pretty well. It's a decent choice for this book, although I would argue third person limited could do the same job and attract a wider audience. At least Jane is the type to crack jokes, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of those in a bit, because not all first-person narratives are enjoyable. I'm looking at you, Holden Caulfield. Please shut the fuck up. I'm not the biggest fan of the lore dump at the beginning of chapter 2. I understand why it was done that way, and overall it wasn't done poorly, but this is a book. We have a whole 22 chapters to discover this world. It would be more organic, not to mention funnier, if we learned about the quirks of this world as Jane interacted with it. Maybe instead of learning about the lawsuit that exposed vampires to the world in chapter 2, we might learn about it in chapter 7, when Jane learns about vampires being staked to anthills at dawn. Or maybe in chapter 5, when an older vampire uses Frink or Arnie as a pejorative, and we learn what happened through dropped hints and bits of dialogue. Maybe instead of being told about the specialty aisles at Walmart, Jane has to go to Walmart to buy some of these items, and we learn that she's been passing these aisles for 5 or 6 years without really registering how useful or insulting they actually are. I'm an author myself, so I know what it's like to want to make sure your world is established and accessible, and I especially know the siren song of publishing every word you personally think is very clever. But sometimes you have to let go in favor of allowing your story to grow up on its own. It's fine. I don't think a lore dump for a genuine alternate universe would ever ruin a book for me, or for anyone else who isn't overly critical for the sake of it. But it did stick out quite a bit. I also do, unfortunately, have to bring up a little problem I noticed, which is that this book is definitely a product of its time. If you were a woman, or woman adjacent, I suppose, feminine in temperament or presentation, there was a sort of undercurrent of polite misogyny. Not that there wasn't also just outright woman hatred all over the goddamn place, but especially woman to woman. There was a tendency for women to want to put themselves apart. Not that Jane is jumping up and down with her hand in the air. I don't even know that I can explain without then questioning if I'm hallucinating a problem that isn't there. But that's how it works. For example, when she's fired by her evil boss, Mrs. Stubblefield, she's replaced by a woman named Posey, who's so dumb she accidentally sets all of her workplaces on fire. And Jane has no faith in her to be able to function in a library. Now, obviously, librarians go to school to do what they do, and Posey is just some lady who's related to the head librarian and got her job through nepotism, so Jane is right to be outraged at being replaced by someone who isn't qualified. But the way she picks at Posey seems targeted. It's personal. And of course, we can justify this with Posey's past as a bully to Jane. We can point to Jane picking at herself as well, and her prior partners, and even Gabriel, who she accuses of all sorts of terrible things. Like I said, I can't really pin it down. If you were there, you know what I mean. And if you weren't, bless you, and may you always know peace. This feels very real to me, and it doesn't ruin the book at all. Jane is a human person, or, well, she's not anymore, but she has a very human personality. She's a woman living in 2009 in a small town where women get married young and family life is culturally valued, which means she's practically a spinster at 27. She may like herself and the life she's built for herself. But everyone has shortcomings, and everyone has things they're embarrassed about, even if they're also embarrassed about being embarrassed about them. I think there's a tendency to look at something problematic and say it shouldn't be written. But I personally think that's a stupid way to go about analysis and critique. The important thing to keep in mind is what makes sense for the character, which I think this does. And also, if something problematic is enough to turn you off, you can always put down a book. I will admit the polite misogyny is not my cup of tea, but I was a closeted lesbian in 2009, and I remember the struggle of both wanting to be accepted by women and not wanting to be seen as insipid and tiresome by the men who were going to be my future bosses and colleagues. I was young back then, and being told my best bet was to become one of the boys, even at the expense of my own self-respect. It was never going to work, and thankfully, I learned that pretty quickly. But I still have empathy for women who got stuck there. Like I said, this is a product of its time. Take it or leave it. Ultimately, there's a lot to like so far, and I'm hooked. I hope the author continues to show this love for her protagonist as well, because it's great to see, and it makes the book breezy and fun. For somebody like me, who has trouble reading anything with fonts smaller than the second line on the ophthalmologist chart, that's always appreciated. This is the stop where those of you, if any exist, who are here for book review and analysis only should exit the car. This next part is where we explore the episode theme, which is transformation in fiction, especially of the taboo variety. To anyone who stuck around, thank you, and you're welcome to return next time. Anybody else, which is probably just the one person who asked for this, we're moving on to, well, it would have been the fun part. Ramona still hasn't shown up, so I guess I'm shouting into the void. I do have some notes that I'd hope to bounce off her, so it won't be completely chaotic, but yeah. Sorry for that. I think I'll write something down for next time, just in case she flakes out on me again. I will also try to do some editing and take out any stutters or dead air, but I will admit that every so often I touch an electronic device and it dies on contact. So I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to computer stuff. So when we're talking about vampires in contemporary fiction, usually it's in a more positive light. The protagonist becomes a vampire or is friends with vampires. The elements of transformation, like they might be scary, but it's not something like entirely abhorrent. That's not always been the case, but I would argue that even before becoming a vampire was cool, there was a draw to it. There's sort of an eroticism in transformation for a hell of a lot of us. You see it all throughout historical art and literature. Like, think of the fish people of Innsmouth or Frankenstein's monster. Like, horror becomes flesh and desire as well. People make jokes about biblically accurate things right now, like on the internet, which I'm not on much, but like I am on there occasionally. But like, descriptions of divine inspiration are like, they're violent and erotic and transcendent. I think it's not very controversial to say that, a lot of people would prefer to be a little stronger or better looking or smarter than they are. I know I would prefer to be smarter and stronger than I am, but even the opposite is enticing, isn't it? Transformation is sort of the essential body horror, and there's definitely an element of violation in it. But at the same time, there's an element of empowerment too. Some people, some writers, approach it positively, and some don't. And sometimes it's, up to us as readers to make that determination. And that's what I like best. But I will admit that I just really like a good story. So I'm thinking of two major examples here. The first one is a novella by Jeremy Ray called Petrified Women. It's billed as a thriller, and I suppose that it could be considered one, but honestly, it's one of the only books I've read in the past 5-6 years that made me cry. I won't mince words here. The subject matter is harrowing, and there's no subtlety. But sometimes you don't need to be subtle. You don't need sleight of hand. The author wanted to tell a story, straightforwardly told it, and wrapped it up on a hopeful note, which I really appreciated. I actually wrote down a plot summary. People sensitive to intimate partner violence should skip past this section. If I've managed to do it right, it should be pretty easy. Sorry if I fucked that up. So the protagonist, Harley, is a meek woman whose MO her whole life has been to freeze up and let bad things happen to her, even when there are serious consequences. And as a result, she has a lot of guilt and self-loathing from childhood accidents and an incident of intimate partner violence from a prior relationship. It's not marital rape because they weren't married, but whatever the dating equivalent of that is. I'm sure that there's a legal term for it, but I don't know what it is. It's very real to an uncomfortable and unpleasant degree, especially the part where she allows her new partner, Aiden, to manipulate her into believing that the things he does are okay because she should be able to handle them. The story is told in flashes. She's in the present, attempting to pull a prank on Aiden, and in the past, remembering all of this, convincing herself to go through with it because Aiden's love language is so-called practical jokes. But if anybody did the things he does to scare the shit out of her, to me, I'd leave them immediately. We're shown how effectively he gaslights her before he ever enters the picture. Her prank is not a kind one. She intends to make herself taller and bulkier, put a stocking over her face, and jump out of his closet with a fake taser. And somehow that's still not as mean as some of his prior pranks on her. As she's preparing in his kitchen, she says hello to the statues in his home, and we learn that he's an artist. these wooden statues are his work, and she's become so attached to them that she mourns when they sell. And she's given them all names and talks to them like they're real. She's a lonely woman who does not socialize with people very well. I wonder why. Anyway, she situates herself in his closet, and he finally comes home, but what do you know? He has a woman with him. At first, she's incensed, but the woman doesn't come into the room and seems reluctant to engage in sex. And Harley begins to think Aiden knows her plan and decided to prank her back. So she thinks she should wait in the closet and play it off like she was never bothered in the first place because she knew he was pranking her. Very healthy, very normal dynamic, am I right? She can't see, but she hears some bad shit go down, and it triggers a flashback to her own assault. And then when she comes out of it, she hears Aiden kill the woman violently. The current story is told primarily through sound and scent, which is super relevant if you have ever dealt with PTSD or anything like that. And she wants so badly to jump out of the closet and help this woman, but again, she's frozen, like she always has been. She is very guilty about this, especially when the woman dies and she can only begin to move to try and save her own life. She manages to lure Aiden out of the apartment with some clever text messages and almost escapes, but makes some critical errors. Aiden almost manages to manipulate her into believing it was all a prank on her and the body is just a prop, but she knows better, and Aiden almost succeeds in killing her too. But the statues, who are revealed to be of women he kills when Harley is not around, come to life and protect Harley, killing Aiden. They just fucking rip him apart. In the end, Harley manages to find her power amongst other victimized women, joining with them and allowing them to get their revenge. Aiden killed these women, but Harley managed to keep them alive in a sense by loving what was left, even if what was left was shaped by Aiden's violent hands. The last few paragraphs are told through another man's eyes as he tries to understand Harley. He wants to date her, and he's just undergone a pretty nasty interrogation from her best friend. She invites him home, where they sit outside and chat, and he notices some pretty statues of women amongst the trees. The last relieving lines, and they are relieving in the sense that Harley is in good hands, are that the statues like him. This one takes on transformation in both like a psychological and metaphysical sense. I mean, Harley transforms. She doesn't magically get over her trauma or suddenly have an ability to push past it, which just isn't a realistic thing, but she does learn the power of solidarity and like ownership of yourself, if that makes sense. And the women Aiden killed transcend. They're no longer objects, for Aiden to look at as trophies, but they're entities with their own will. And Harley, she could have been terrified of them or seen them as monsters, but instead she welcomed them as sisters and friends. It's a love story. Not between Harley and any of the guys she dated, but between Harley and herself and the statues she named and breathed life into. I don't think it needs romance to be a love story. It's kind of horrible, and yeah, it did make me cry, which is unfortunate because I'm allergic to my own tears, but I definitely suggest it if you have an hour or so to spare. It's not very long, and it is very good. My other example is more straightforward, I suppose. I don't read comics very often, and when I do, it's usually stuff like Nailbiter or Chew, which, okay, yeah, I know, don't judge my choices. But there's one Japanese comic artist I do know, Junji Ito. The first comic of his I ever read was a short story called The Enigma of Amigara Fault, which hopefully anybody hearing this already knows. In the story, an earthquake uncovers like a rock face with a bunch of people-shaped holes in it. So the protagonist goes to check it out and he finds a bunch of like other people there, including a bunch of other curious onlookers, but scientists went to look at it. Neat. So pretty soon, a man strips off his clothes for no reason, and he rushes over to the rock face and steps into one of the people-shaped holes, and he says that it is his hole and he has to go in. I'm not recalling this perfectly, but it's very close. So others start to do this as well, and nobody can get them out because the holes are deep and they are ever so incrementally narrow. So the people who are compelled to push forward get stuck inside the holes, like presumably to die and rot there. Eventually, the protagonist's friend, who he met while he was not studying the rock but observing it, she leaves in the middle of the night to find her hole, and the protagonist is like, well, better go find mine. So then months later, on the other side of the mountain, a team of scientists is looking at a cracked rock face and marveling at something moving inside of it. Wonder what it could be. The final panel is a sort of horrible, stretched and twisted person, still alive, still pushing forward in the tiny crack. It isn't clear if this is our protagonist from before or the first man who went to find his hole, but it's horrific and it is beautiful. Like that image, I read this, I don't know, it's gotta be at least a decade and a half ago, and I can still see this with perfect clarity in my mind. It's wonderful. And it's just, it stuck with me because you don't know what that person is thinking. They're alive, so, presumably they're thinking something. They went through this like awful, painful, unceasing torment and came out transformed. So much that people aren't sure what they're seeing, actually. They went into their hole because they had to. Like something compelled them to seek it out. And now they've reached the end. They know everything there is to know, don't they? Maybe they don't know the things we usually think of as important, like complex math, or how to deal with the climate crisis, or how to cure every cancer, or whether gods exist, or whatever. But they know what it is to transcend. They know the limits of human flesh. One might argue humanity. One not being me, but you could make that argument. Horror become flesh, like I said before. What could possibly matter after that? Will they continue on in the same direction, forever, continually just changing as the world shapes them? Or is the only logical conclusion to drop dead at the end of the tunnel? We don't find out. That's not the point. The point is the beauty and horror of the transformation itself. I think about that a lot. I think about what will happen to me if I give in to the compulsion to enter my hole. Sometimes it seems bleak and awful, and sometimes it feels like the best idea in the world. But there's more than one voice calling, isn't there? Vampires aren't as en vogue as they used to be, but I still think it's worth a chat every once in a while. From Dracula to the Avatar to the Zhongshi to, even the weirdos from Twilight. Vampires are monsters. They're meant to terrify you, but we love stories about them. To varying degrees over time, we've made vampires into heroes. But if I'm honest, it wouldn't matter if we had. There's always been a portion of us who love monsters, and that's okay. There's always been a portion of us who identify with monsters, and that's okay too. I think probably those of us who identify with monsters are the same ones who have taken them and turned them into heroes. It's like a narrative transformation, a cultural transformation, if you will. And yeah, that's okay too. It's definitely worth considering if you identify with vampires or other monsters. It's worth considering, do you want to change, or do you just feel powerless? Or, you could just have a kink. That's also fine, so long as it doesn't harm anyone. What you're into is whatever, I guess. I don't really have any more notes. I wish that it had been a little more structured, but next time I'll have something more comprehensive, just in case Mona doesn't show up again. I hope she does, but apparently this is not a guaranteed thing. If you've stuck around this long, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, stay tuned.